The history of African literature, periods, themes, authors, and contexts. African literature, in its vastness and diversity, is both a record and a shaper of the continent's history, cultures, and identities. It is not merely a collection of texts, but a living tradition that encompasses oral and written forms, indigenous and colonial languages, and a spectrum of genres from epic poetry to digital storytelling. The evolution of African literature, inseparable from Africa's social, political, and linguistic transformations from the ancient oral traditions and manuscript cultures, through the upheavals of colonialism, to the vibrant, globally recognized contemporary scene. This presentation traces the major periods of African literary history, exploring key themes, authors, works, and the socio-political contexts that shaped them. It also examines regional variations and the enduring tension between indigenous and colonial languages, offering a comprehensive view of African literature's past and present. Oral traditions, the foundations of African literature. 1. The nature and significance of orature. African literature's origins are deeply rooted in oral traditions, what Ugandan scholar P.O. Ziramu termed orature, to emphasize its artistry and performative nature. Orature encompasses a wide array of forms: myths, epics, folktales, proverbs, riddles, praise poetry, songs, and ritual performances. These forms were not simply entertainment. They were the primary means of transmitting history, values, cosmologies, and social norms across generations. The oral tradition is characterized by its communal nature, performance context, and adaptability. Storytellers, griots in West Africa, Imbongas among the Xhosa, or bards in various cultures, were custodians of collective memory, historians, genealogists, and social critics. Their performances were interactive, often involving music, dance, and audience participation, making the act of storytelling a living, evolving process. 2. Forms and functions of orature. Oral literature in Africa is rich and varied, with forms and functions shaped by region, language, and social context. Epics and heroic narratives. The Epic of Sundiata Mali, the Mwindo Epic Congo, and the Ozidi Saga Nigeria are among Africa's great oral epics, recounting the deeds of legendary founders and heroes. These narratives serve to legitimize political authority, transmit moral codes, and reinforce communal identity. Folk tales and trickster stories. Trickster figures such as Anansi Ghana, Ajapa the tortoise Yoruba, and Sungura the hare East Africa are central to African folk tales. These stories, often humorous and subversive, teach lessons about wit, survival, and the complexities of human nature. Proverbs and riddles. Proverbs distill communal wisdom into memorable, metaphorical statements, while riddles sharpen wit and foster critical thinking. Both are integral to socialization and dispute resolution. Praise poetry and songs. Praise poets, griots, Imbongas, or praise singers compose and perform poems that celebrate rulers, ancestors, and community values. Songs accompany every aspect of life work, ritual, love, mourning, reinforcing social bonds and cultural continuity. 3. The griot tradition and social roles. In West Africa, the griot jelly tradition is particularly prominent. Griots are hereditary oral historians, musicians, and advisors who preserve genealogies, epics, and social memory. They play vital roles in ceremonies, mediate disputes, and even influence political decisions. While griots enjoy prestige for their knowledge, they often occupy a distinct social caste, sometimes marginalized yet indispensable to communal life. 4. Orality and the transition to written literature. Oral and written traditions in Africa have always interacted. The structures, motifs, and performance techniques of orature profoundly influence later written forms. Even as literacy spread, many African writers drew on oral traditions to shape their narratives, characters, and themes. The oral tradition's emphasis on metaphor, cyclical time, and communal experience remains a defining feature of African literature across periods. 2. Pre-colonial written traditions and manuscript cultures. 1. Ancient Egypt and North African literatures. Africa's written literary history is ancient, with some of the world's earliest writing systems originating on the continent. Ancient Egypt's hieroglyphics, dating back to around 3000 BCE, were used to record religious texts, political events, and mythologies. The Book of the Dead, pyramid texts, and love poetry from the New Kingdom period are among the earliest examples of African written literature. In North Africa, the spread of Islam from the 7th century brought Arabic as a literary language. Scholars in Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco produced works in theology, philosophy, poetry, and history. The Maghreb region became a center of Arabic literary production, with figures like Ibn Khaldun, Tunisia, 14th century contributing foundational works in historiography and social theory. 2. The Sahel and West African manuscript cultures. The Sahelian cities of Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao in present-day Mali emerged as major centers of Islamic scholarship from the 13th to the 16th centuries. The famous Timbuktu manuscripts estimated at over 300,000 cover subjects ranging from astronomy, law, and medicine to poetry and philosophy. These manuscripts, written in Arabic and Ajami African languages in Arabic script, testify to a sophisticated literary culture that challenges stereotypes of pre-colonial Africa as without history. The preservation and digitization of the Timbuktu manuscripts in the 21st century have revealed the depth and diversity of West African intellectual life. Manuscript libraries, often maintained by families for generations, are now recognized as part of the world's heritage, though they remain vulnerable to conflict and environmental threats. 3. The Horn of Africa, Ethiopian and Somali literatures. Ethiopia boasts one of Africa's oldest written traditions, with literature in Jz classical Ethiopic dating back to at least the 4th century CE. The Kebernegist Glory of Kings, 14th century, is a foundational text, blending myth, history, and religious allegory to legitimize the Solomonic dynasty. Other significant works include royal chronicles, hagiographies, and religious poetry. Amharic, Tigrinya, and other languages later became vehicles for literary production, especially after the introduction of the printing press in the 19th century. Somali literature, though primarily oral, also developed a written tradition using Arabic script, Wadad writing, and later the Osmania script. Somali poetry, renowned for its complexity and social function, has been transcribed and published since the 20th century. 4. Swahili Coast and East African manuscripts. The Swahili coast, stretching from Somalia to Mozambique, developed a rich literary culture under the influence of Islam and Indian Ocean trade. Swahili literature, written in Arabic script, includes epic poems, utenzi, love poetry, and religious treatises. The Utendi Washington Tambuka, The Story of Tambuka, 1728, is one of the earliest known Swahili epics, blending local and Islamic themes. 5. Indigenous scripts and Ajami traditions. Beyond Arabic and Latin scripts, Africa is home to indigenous writing systems such as Nsibidi, South, Eastern Nigeria, Tifana Tuareg, North Africa, and Vai Liberia. The Ajami tradition writing African languages in Arabic script flourished in Hausa, Fulani, Wolof, and other languages, enabling the recording of poetry, legal documents, and correspondence. 3. The colonial encounter, literature, language, and resistance. 1. The impact of colonialism on African languages and literature. The arrival of European colonial powers from the late 15th century onward profoundly reshaped Africa's linguistic and literary landscape. Colonial administrations imposed their languages English, French, Portuguese, German, Spanish on education, governance, and publishing. Indigenous languages were often marginalized or suppressed, and literacy in colonial languages became a marker of social mobility and modernity. Colonial education systems prioritized Western literary models, introducing new genres: the novel, the short story, the modern play, and values. Yet, African writers adapted these forms, infusing them with local themes, oral motifs, and cultural perspectives. The tension between indigenous and colonial languages became a central issue, with some writers embracing the colonial language for its reach, while others, like Ngugi Washington Thiong'o, later advocated for writing in African languages as an act of decolonization. 2. Early written works and slave narratives. The earliest African literature in European languages often took the form of slave narratives, travelogues, and missionary accounts. Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, 1789, is a landmark work, blending autobiography, abolitionist argument, and ethnographic detail. Equiano's narrative, widely read in Britain and America, challenged stereotypes and humanized the African experience of enslavement. Other early works include Thomas Mo Folo's Chaka, 1925, in Sesotho, which reimagines the life of the Zulu king, and Joseph Ephraim Casely Hayford's Ethiopia Unbound, 1911, in English, one of the first African novels to address race and emancipation. 3. Colonial era literature. Themes and movements. Colonial era African literature is marked by ambivalence, negotiation, and resistance. Writers grappled with the contradictions of colonial modernity, the erosion of traditional authority, and the search for identity. Common themes include tradition versus modernity, the clash between ancestral customs and Western values, often dramatized through generational or gender conflict, cultural alienation and hybridity, the experience of being between worlds, negotiating multiple identities and languages. Resistance and satire, literature as a tool for critiquing colonial rule, exposing injustice, and imagining liberation. In Francophone Africa, the Negritude movement emerged in the 1930s as a literary and ideological response to colonial assimilation. Founded by Léopold Sédar Senghor Senegal, Aimé Césaire Martinique, and Léon Gontran Damas Guyana, Negritude celebrated Black identity, African heritage, and the value of oral tradition. Its poetry, rich in symbolism and rhythm, sought to reclaim pride and dignity in the face of racism and cultural denigration. In Anglophone Africa, writers like Amos Tutuola, The Palmwine Drinkard, 1952, and Cyprian Equincy, People of the City, 1954, pioneered the modern African novel, drawing on oral storytelling and urban experience. Tutuola's use of non-standard English and Yoruba folklore was both celebrated and controversial, highlighting debates about authenticity and literary standards. 4. Language politics and the rise of African language literature. The question of language became increasingly contentious. While colonial languages offered access to wider audiences and publishing infrastructure, they also risked alienating local readers and perpetuating cultural dependency. Some writers, such as Ngugi Washington Thiong'o Kenya, shifted from English to Gikuyu, arguing in Decolonizing the Mind 1986 that language is central to cultural liberation. Others, like Chinua Achebe Nigeria, defended the creative appropriation of English, infusing it with Igbo proverbs, rhythms, and worldviews. 4. The Age of Independence, Post-Colonial Literature and Nation Building. 1. The explosion of literary production. The decades surrounding African independence, 1950s-1970s, witnessed an unprecedented flowering of literary activity. As colonial rule ended, writers became chroniclers and critics of the new nations, grappling with the promises and disillusionments of self-rule. The period saw the emergence of canonical figures whose works are now central to world literature. 2. Chinua Achebe and the Modern African Novel. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, 1958, is widely regarded as the foundational text of modern African literature. Set in pre-colonial and colonial Igbo society, the novel explores the tragic consequences of cultural collision and the complexities of tradition, masculinity, and change. Achebe's narrative style, blending English with Igbo idioms and oral forms, set a new standard for authenticity and literary craft. Achebe's subsequent novels, No Longer at Ease 1960, Arrow of God 1964, A Man of the People 1966, and Anthills of the Savannah 1987, extend his exploration of colonialism, corruption, and the moral dilemmas of modernity. His influence is profound, shaping generations of African writers and scholars. 3. Wole Soyinka and the Drama of Resistance. Wole Soyinka, Nigeria, the first African Nobel laureate in literature 1986, is renowned for his plays, poetry, and essays. His works such as A Dance of the Forest 1960, The Lion and the Jewel 1959, and Death and the King's Horseman 1975 draw on Yoruba mythology, satire, and political critique. Soyinka's engagement with tyranny, tradition, and the role of the artist has made him a global voice for freedom and justice. 4. Francophone and Lusophone literatures. Negritude, liberation, and disillusionment. In Francophone Africa, the legacy of negritude continued to shape poetry and prose. Leopold Sedar Senghor's lyricism, Birago Diop's evocations of oral tradition, and Mongo Betty's satirical novels, The Poor Christ of Bamba, 1956, exemplify the diversity of themes and styles. The post-independence period also saw the rise of engaged literature, critiquing neocolonialism, dictatorship, and social injustice. In Lusophone Africa, literature was closely tied to the liberation struggles against Portuguese colonialism. Writers like Agostinho Neto, Angola, Noemia de Souza, Mozambique, and later Mia Couto and José Eduardo Agualusa used poetry and fiction to articulate resistance, national identity, and the ambiguities of post-colonial life. The 1990s marked a shift toward new themes: disillusionment, memory, and the legacy of violence reflected in the works of Pepetela, Paulina Chiziane, and Onjaki. 5. East and Southern African literatures. Land, identity, and apartheid. In East Africa, Ngugi Washington Thiong'o's novels, Weep Not, Child 1964, The River Between 1965, A Grain of Wheat 1967, explore the Mau Mau Rebellion, land dispossession, and the tensions between tradition and modernity. Ngugi's later commitment to writing in Gikuyu and his advocacy for linguistic decolonization have made him a leading theorist of African literature. Southern African literature is deeply marked by the experience of apartheid. South African writers Nadine Gordimer, J. M. Coetzee, Athol Fugard, Alex Laguma, Bessie Head used fiction, drama, and poetry to expose racial injustice, censorship, and the complexities of resistance. Gordimer's novels Burger's Daughter, 1979, July's People, 1981, and Coetzee's allegorical works Disgrace, 1999 are internationally acclaimed for their moral and psychological depth. 6. Women writers and feminist perspectives. The post-independence era saw the emergence of powerful women's voices, challenging patriarchal norms and expanding the thematic range of African literature. Flora Nwapa Efuru, 1966, Buchi Emecheta, The Joys of Motherhood, 1979. Mariama Ba, Salonga Letter, 1979. Ama Ata Edu, Our Sister Killjoy, 1977. And Sitsi Dangaremba, Nervous Conditions, 1988. Foregrounded issues of gender, motherhood, education, and autonomy. Their works interrogate the intersections of tradition, modernity, and colonial legacy, often portraying women's struggles for self-definition within oppressive social structures. The rise of feminist criticism and the inclusion of women's writing in curricula have transformed the landscape of African literary studies. V. Contemporary African literature, globalization, innovation, and new voices. 1. The expansion of genres and themes. Since the late 20th century, African literature has become increasingly diverse in form, theme, and audience. Writers experiment with magical realism. Ben Okri, The Famished Road, 1991, speculative fiction, Nnedi Okorafor, Tay Thompson, crime and detective fiction, and digital storytelling. The boundaries between oral and written, local and global, are ever more porous. Contemporary themes include urbanization and migration, the complexities of city life, diaspora, and transnational identity central to works by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Americana, 2013, Tiju Cole Open City, 2011, and Novio Le Bulawayo We Need New Names, 2013. Gender and Sexuality. New generations of writers explore LGBTQ identities, gender fluidity, and the politics of the body, challenging taboos and expanding the scope of African literature. Memory, trauma, and healing. The aftermath of war, genocide, and displacement is addressed in novels by Abdulrazak Gurna Paradise, 1994, Jennifer Nansubuga Makambi Kintu, 2014, and others. Afrofuturism and speculative fiction. Afrofuturist writers imagine alternative futures, blending African mythologies with science fiction and fantasy. Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon and Tay Thompson's Rosewater trilogy exemplify this trend, integrating folklore, technology, and post-human themes. 2. Language, publishing, and digital platforms. While colonial languages remain dominant in publishing, there is renewed interest in writing and translating works in African languages. Digital platforms, self-publishing, and literary blogs such as Brittle Paper have democratized access, enabling new voices to reach global audiences. The rise of literary prizes, the Caine Prize for African Writing, the Grand Prix of Literary Associations, the Booker Prize has brought international recognition to African writers. However, challenges remain: limited local readership, high book prices, censorship, and the marginalization of African language literature. 3. Literature as activism and social critique. African literature continues to serve as a platform for activism, social critique, and the defense of human rights. Writers such as Ken Saro-Wiwa, executed in 1995 for his activism in Nigeria, Ngugi Washington Thiong'o, exiled for his political plays, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a global feminist voice, exemplify the risks and responsibilities of the African writer. Censorship, repression, and exile remain realities in many countries. Yet, literature also offers hope, resilience, and the possibility of imagining new futures. VI. Regional variations and case studies. 1. Nigerian literary history and movements. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, has produced a remarkable array of writers across genres and languages. The Onitsha market literature of the 1950s and 1960s, popular pamphlets, novellas, and pulp fiction demonstrates the vitality of local publishing and the interplay between oral and written forms. The Nigerian literary canon includes Achebe, Soyinka, Flora Nwapa, Buchi Emecheta, Ben Okri, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and many others. Nigerian literature is characterized by its engagement with history, politics, gender, and the negotiation of tradition and modernity. 2. Senegal, Negritude, and Francophone West Africa. Senegal is the birthplace of Negritude and a center of Francophone literary innovation. Leopold Sedar Senghor's poetry, Ousmane Sembène's novels and films, and Mariam Aba's feminist classic So Long a Letter exemplify the region's contributions. The interplay of oral tradition, Islamic scholarship, and French literary forms is a hallmark of Senegalese literature. 3. Kenya and East African literary politics. Kenya's literary history is shaped by the Mau Mau Rebellion, land politics, and debates over language. Ngugi Washington Thiong'o's shift from English to Gikuyu, his imprisonment for political theater, and his advocacy for African language literature have made Kenya a focal point for discussions of decolonization and cultural sovereignty. 4. North African Arabic and Amazigh literatures. North African literature, in Arabic, Amazigh Berber, and French, reflects the region's complex history of Islamization, Arabization, and colonialism. Naguib Mahfouz Egypt, the first Arab Nobel laureate in literature, is celebrated for his Cairo trilogy, which chronicles Egyptian society across generations. Amazigh oral poetry, Isefra, and contemporary Amazigh literature assert indigenous identity and resist marginalization. 5. Southern Africa, apartheid, resistance, and reconciliation. South African literature is indelibly marked by the struggle against apartheid. Black and white writers alike Nadine Gordimer, J. M. Coetzee, Athol Fugard, Eski Mfulele, Bessie Head use literature to expose injustice, imagine alternatives, and grapple with the challenges of reconciliation. Post-apartheid literature continues to address issues of race, memory, and nationhood. 6. The Horn of Africa and Central Africa. Ethiopian literature, with its ancient Jay-Z and Amharic traditions, is unique in Africa for its continuity and depth. Somali poetry, Eritrean and Sudanese literatures, and the manuscript cultures of the Horn reflect the region's diversity and resilience. Central African literature, including Congolese writers like Soni Labu Tanzi, is known for its experimentalism, political satire, and engagement with the traumas of dictatorship and conflict. 7. Major themes across periods. 1. Tradition versus modernity. The tension between ancestral customs and the forces of modernization is a persistent theme. Literature explores the costs and possibilities of change, the erosion of communal values, and the search for new forms of belonging. 2. Colonialism, identity, and resistance. The experience of colonialism, its violence, cultural disruption, and legacy remain central. Writers interrogate the construction of identity, the politics of representation, and the strategies of resistance, drawing on post-colonial theory. Edward said, Frantz Fanon, Homi Bhabha to analyze hybridity, mimicry, and the third space. 3. Gender, women writers, and feminism. African literature increasingly foregrounds women's experiences, challenging patriarchal norms and advocating for gender justice. Feminist writers and critics highlight the intersections of gender, tradition, and modernity, and the ways in which women navigate and transform their worlds. 4. Language politics and the quest for authenticity. The choice of language, colonial or indigenous, remains a site of contestation. Writers debate the possibilities and limitations of each, experimenting with code switching, translation, and the creative appropriation of linguistic resources. 5. Diaspora, migration, and transnationalism. Contemporary African literature is increasingly transnational, shaped by migration, exile, and the global circulation of texts. Diasporic writers explore themes of displacement, hybridity, and the negotiation of multiple identities. 6. Orality, myth, and the influence of tradition. Oral motifs, mythic structures, and performance techniques continue to inform modern fiction, poetry, and drama. The interplay between orature and literature is a source of innovation and continuity. 8. Archives, preservation, and the future of African literature. 1. Manuscript preservation and digitization. Efforts to preserve Africa's manuscript heritage, such as the digitization of the Timbuktu manuscripts, are crucial for safeguarding the continent's intellectual legacy. International collaborations, local initiatives, and technological innovations are expanding access and awareness, though challenges remain. 2. Anthologies, curricula, and pedagogy. Anthologies and literary curricula play a vital role in shaping the canon and introducing new generations to African literature. The inclusion of diverse voices, genres, and languages is essential for a more representative and dynamic field. 3. Digital publishing and the democratization of literature. Digital platforms, self-publishing, and social media are transforming the production, distribution, and reception of African literature. Writers can now reach global audiences, experiment with new forms, and bypass traditional gatekeepers. However, issues of access, infrastructure, and sustainability persist. Conclusion: African literature as a living tradition. African literature is not a static archive, but a living, evolving tradition. It is a mirror of the continent's histories, struggles, and aspirations, a space where myth and history, orality and writing, tradition and innovation converge. From the griot's performance to the digital novel, from the Timbuktu manuscripts to Afrofuturist visions, African literature continues to shape and be shaped by the realities of its people. The future of African literature lies in its diversity, resilience, and capacity for renewal. As new voices emerge, genres expand, and technologies evolve, African literature will remain a vital force for cultural expression, social critique, and the imagination of new worlds.